I had earlier spoken via your platform on Modinomics a couple of years ago. Obviously, it was in person. This is virtual. And thank you to Aparna on your side for helping organizing all of this. Rajiv and I are both extremely indebted for this platform. I'll talk to you. The way we'll do is the book has 5 chapters. So I'll just kind of introduce the book. Rajiv will speak through chapters 1, 3, and 5. I'll speak through chapters 2 and 4. And then we'll both kind of conclude together. And after that, we might have time for questions, as Rahul says. And the book, I'll just kind of go through the introduction first. And the names of the chapters I'll mention towards the end. And it will be self-explanatory as we go along as well. The format would be, we'll speak extempore for some bit. We'll also read a bit. And then we'll explain those extracts. And we'll keep it relatively free-flowing. In 2013, 2013 is when we first started writing about the idea of India title. It was, I'll just read out from the book itself. The genesis of the book is traceable to a debate on political philosophy. Speaking to New York Times, he had observed that Modi's politics is against the idea of India. The idea of India has a clear place for minorities as minorities, not minorities simply as individuals. So responding to this, we had written an op-ed in Mint called "Let Us Debate the Idea of India." And that led to more debates in Indian Express. We were fortunate to have Nirmala Sitharaman, who's right now the Honorable Finance Minister, join on our side. People like Javed Anand joined on the side of Professor Ashutosh Varshney. Many other people commented on it through 2014. And that was an interesting kind of debate which kind of showed us the fault lines of Indian philosophy, of people who say they are for individual rights actually get really worried when actually people start talking about individual rights. So just on that, again, since we are introducing the book and we're not in the first chapter, I'd like to quickly read a note on labels. So in India, we routinely use terms such as right and left in our political discourse. That's understandable. I and Rajiv and I also do it. But the meaning ascribed to these terms in Western democracies is hardly transferable to India. And in fact, I would argue now they're not even applicable to the West as much to that extent. In the West, nonetheless, they have the connotations of conservative and progressive, that is right and left, especially on social issues. And on economic issues, they generally have the connotation of more liberal markets on the right, more redistribution on the left. In India, obviously, the label is primarily associated, the right label is associated with the party BJP, Bharatiya Janata Party, rooted in the Sangh Parivar or Hindutva politics. Just as the right is used loosely for the BJP, the left is used loosely for the Congress or actual leftist parties or center-left regional parties. And often the overarching term for that is Nehruvian. And we also discussed in the book how that may not be the same as Nehru's politics himself, but Nehruvian is a term that is often used. But we say that there are many shades of Hindutva, just like there are many shades of Zionism in Israel, or Christian Democrats, or Islamism, or Confucianism. In fact, the term Hindutva, even though it was not invented by Savarkar, was popularized by Savarkar. And he actually wanted to tame the centrifugal forces of region and language and the stratifying forces of caste with that of a unifying identity of Hindutva. The reason why that is important is, in this process, while he obviously othered to some extent Islam and Christianity, the two proselytizing monotheistic global faiths, and together the global majority. But given India's medieval as well as modern colonial history, as well as a subsequent religion-based partition of the Indian subcontinent, it cannot be said that there was no truth whatsoever in his conceptualization. Moreover, Savarkar was explicit that all Indian citizens, irrespective of religion, were to be treated equally by the state. This facet of history is not well known about Savarkar on all sides of the spectrum. Hence the subtitle of the books, Civilizational Rights, Individual Rights in a Civilizational State. Now, let's try to understand terms civilization, nation, state. Let's go to nation first. In 1882, this French philosopher, person called Ernest Renan, said in his talk, "What is a Nation?" He said that race, language, community, religion, geography, military, they're not enough by themselves to create the basis of a nation. He said that the nation is a soul. It is a spiritual principle. Basically, he was saying that a nation is a nation if it thinks it's a nation. Two things which properly speaking are really one and the same. One is the past. You need to have a sense of a common past. You need to agree on the present, even if you disagree on specific policies. And you need to have a common vision about the future. He said, man does not improvise. the nation, like the individual, is the outcome of a long past of efforts, sacrifices, and devotions. That sense of shared past is extremely important. But obviously, a civilization is a broader entity than a nation, and we'll come to this in chapter 2 as well. Civilization can be considered to be the broadest section of humanity, short of all of humanity itself, right? I mean, if you go by the Indian civilizations, 1 out of 6 human beings, it is so unique and distinct enough that it can be called a civilization. And there is no meta grouping above India which would qualify it as a civilization. Whereas you cannot say that about, say, the France or United States. The France or United States can be classified as quote unquote West. And therefore, the nation does not coincide with the civilization in the case of the France or United States. It does in the case of India, more or less. Now let's come to the word dharma, the Sanskrit word dharma, which we think is the best word to encapsulate the word civilization as far as India goes. And it is one of those non-translatables in English, right? And as a great Sanskrit scholar, Pandurang Vaman Kane, he opined dharma is one of those words that defy all attempts at the exact rendering in English or any other tongue. In his history of Dharma Shastra, he wrote, the writers on Dharma Shastra meant by dharma not a creed, not a religion, but a mode of life or a code of conduct, which regulated a person's work and activities as a member of society and as an individual, and was intended to bring about the gradual development of a person to enable him to reach what was deemed to be the goal of human existence. But let me continue the final section of this opening segment, which will talk about the book's title, cover, and outline. And that will lay the groundwork for what Rajeev is about to do with chapter 1, and then we'll alternate. So when the Constituent Committee finished the task of drafting the Republic of India's constitution, the leadership asked an artist called Nandlal Bose to illustrate the constitution. Bose was a protege of Abhindranath Tagore from the family of Rabindranath Tagore. And Abhindranath Tagore was the founder of the Bengal School of Art. And he was the first person to draw, or at least the most famously draw, Bharat Mata in 1905. The choice of Bose, who was affiliated with Tagore, to lead the project says a lot. And this was as you can see in the book, this is a photo of Ram, Lakshman, and Sita. And this painting or art is actually from the original copy of the Indian Constitution, from the Fundamental Rights section. And this illustration shows a lot, right? Without speaking in words, it shows a lot. The title of the first chapter of this book, which Rajeev will speak about in a couple of minutes, is India, that is Bharat. That is also taken from Article 1.1 of the Constitution of India. A renowned jurist, Nani Palkhiwala, had written in 1974, freedom cannot be inherited in the bloodstream. Each generation must have to fight for it. It can die surely, though not as swiftly in a democracy as well as it does in a totalitarian state. So we have to fight. What is the surest guarantee of freedom that we are talking about in this book? We say that a civilizational republic, a democratic polity based on the rule of law, which in turn is rooted in the millennia-old pluralistic ethos of India, which comes naturally to India. We do not have to kind of explain to our kids what pluralism is. It is literally in the way they grow up, the way they see things all around them. That is the surest guarantee of securing the freedom that Palkhiwala spoke about. India is the only major civilizational republic in the world. China can be called a civilizational state, but it is clearly not a republic. So chapter 1, now what are the 5 chapters? Chapter 1, which Rajeev will talk about, will lay the groundwork for the foundational philosophy of the book, which says that India is a civilization, not just a post-colonial entity, not just post-1947. Chapter 2, which I will talk about, describes how this civilization is transforming into a nation through the instrumentality of a democratic republic. In chapter 3 and 4, we look at individual rights within this framework. Chapter 3, we focus on politics. The name of chapter 3 is Saving Secularism from the Secularists. Chapter 4 is on economics. We say profit is not a dirty word. And finally, in chapter 5, before we conclude, we further explore why this civilization that is now a nation or becoming a nation needs a strong, honest, but limited state. Such a state can harness the size of India for many benefits, economies of scale, while minimizing the inefficiencies inherent in gigantism by focusing on federalism, markets, and an explicit doctrine that recognizes the importance of both diversity as well as unity. So chapter 1 is India, that is Bharat. Rajeev, over to you.
So as Harsh mentioned, chapter 1 is on how India is a civilization and not just a post-colonial entity. So the I think the great flaw that has pervaded our kind of public discourse is that this idea being pushed that somehow India, that is Bharat, was created in 1947 by certain individuals. Well, I'm sure, and as you read the book, you will discover that even those individuals didn't think that. Whether it was Nehru, Gandhi, Patel, Ambedkar, none of them really thought that we are the ones who are creating a country. They saw themselves as inheritors of a very long and very old civilization. And frankly, the ideological inheritors, the successors of those individuals, making such claims about these iconic leaders would have surprised those leaders themselves. So let me start by reading a few lines from this chapter, where we go into why India is a civilization and what it means to be a civilization that is transforming into a nation. So we say in the chapter, skepticism is an indispensable foundation of what is called science. The fundamental premise of scientific inquiry is that an unknown truth can be learned through iterative experimentation and exploration. A school of thought that is dogmatic cannot profess to be scientific. Similarly, an economic system that imbibes such skepticism cannot, by definition, be centrally planned, for that would require an omniscient, omnipotent body to allocate resources. In this sense, socialism is analogous with obscurantist faith, while liberal capitalism is analogous to scientific religion. Also, skepticism and the intellectual humility that it engenders is required to cultivate genuine tolerance in society, for it allows fellow human beings to accept mutual differences. And then from such skepticism flows social diversity. And only if individuals are allowed to syncretically build upon, that is, add and subtract from traditions and practices, without being required to dogmatically treat them as immutable rules, can true diversity really emerge. So I think this is a defining feature of Indian and Hindu civilization, that nothing is treated in a way that, that only this is possible and only this is correct. We have many traditions of Indic thought which accept even opposites and say, who knows, both may be right. And that is best kind of captured in the hymn of creation, the Nasadiya Sukta of the Rig Veda, which very evocatively says, even maybe even the gods don't know what is what. So the fundamental error, I think, as we say in the book, that was made post independence was that India adopted an attitude of a position of certitude that kind of chafed against this kind of skeptical tradition that we have in the country, and we've had for centuries and millennia. This, in terms of economics, obviously translated into kind of socialism and central planning, and those effects are well known. What that resulted in, all kinds of stagnation, poverty, which we will discuss later in this talk today. And the second aspect that was kind of a big flaw imposed upon different intellectuals was that Indian democracy was somehow invented in 1947. The truth actually is that India has very old culture of democracy, and we have deep roots of democracy. In fact, the French political philosopher Tocqueville had recorded in his writings of how India had this democratic culture, even like centuries before, when he came to India, before centuries before independence. So reconciling that social diversity in a democratic context, so the social diversity that comes from skepticism, reconciling that in a democratic context requires that individuals should be at the center, and they should be the building units of all state policy, which is what, the subtitle of the book. It is individual rights in a civilizational state. Finally, Harsh spoke also about dharma. Dharma is one of those, like he said, the words where it's not perfectly translatable. But as Sri Aurobindo had said, as goes Sanatan Dharma, so does Bharat. So Aurobindo had said in a very famous speech that he made in 1909 that for Bharat to survive, for India to survive, Sanatan Dharma has to prosper. In closing, I will just quote a passage that we have also talked about in the book from Swapan Dasgupta's acclaimed book, Awakening Bharat Mata, where he kind of comments on what happened with the Congress and with, which was the natural party of governance in India for so long. Why did they sort of lose out? And he connects it to the civilizational aspect. So I quote from the book: till the lifetime of Indira Gandhi, at least the Congress, despite many secular adjustments, broadly represented the mainstream of Indian nationalism. However, as it progressively vacated the old ground and simultaneously lost its overwhelming political dominance, traditional Indian nationalism increasingly came to be identified with forces that had hitherto been on the fringes. The slow transition of Vande Mataram and Bharat Mata from being a mainstay of the Congress to being identified with the BJP epitomized the shift. So I think this passage very beautifully connects, kind of a high level philosophical point about Indian civilization, about Hindu civilization, to kind of the retail level politics that we have observed in the last 25 years in the country. On that note, Harsh, over to you for chapter 2.
Thank you so much, Rajiv. So Rajiv just spoke about India that is Bharat, or India that is civilization and has been for a long time. And very, very pertinently, the name of chapter 2 is From Civilization to Nation. From this civilization to the construction of a nation. And a good transition quote, we actually start with that, is Dr. Ambedkar's quote, which I think is very, very, very accurate, but also a bit funny. He says, Indians are, of course, quarreling, and no one can prophesy when will they stop quarreling. But granting the fact, what does it establish? Only that Indians are a quarrelsome people. It does not destroy the fact that India is a single geographical unit. Her unity is as ancient as nature. Within this geographical unit and covering the whole of it, there has been a cultural unity since time immemorial. This cultural unity has defied political and racial divisions. I mean, we have also quoted somewhere Nehruji, who, again, somebody you not expected from him. He also says something similar, and he says, despite political and linguistic divisions, very similar to Diana X, sacred geography. So, the civilization being one is something that Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar all understood. Now, that being established, how are we transitioning to a nation? So we begin with a good anecdote. So let us say today it is not uncommon for perhaps 30-year-old educated Indian woman, let us call her Meena or Nina, whatever name you want to give her, to have her father's native village in Punjab, as we Indians call native village. Her mother is in Uttar Pradesh, mother's native village. She herself having grown up in Mumbai or Bombay, having married someone whose family is from Calcutta or Kolkata, with the couple having met in Ahmedabad and currently living in Bangalore. Nor are such examples of relocation, intermarriage restricted to regional or caste boundaries. They are becoming more common, but less common are perhaps across class and religion. As Vinayak Savarkar, Veer Savarkar had said, sexual attraction has proved more powerful than all the commands of all the prophets put together. So what is this identity of this new Indian woman, the kind of example we spoke about? It is not just one. She's a human being, an Indian, a woman, a professional, a wife, a daughter, perhaps a mother, and she can claim to be attached to 6 or more states. She can speak, if not fluently, 4 languages, and she may even understand the most important curse words in a few more languages. She has a soft corner for gurudwaras, for Durga Puja, for laughing Buddhas, and for Feng Shui. So this is not that hypothetical an example if we look around in our own lives. So her identity, we say, is she zones out politics, she hates taxes, and all those curse words coming back when she has to file for her taxes. And Meena is above all, as you might have also have guessed, a Hindu. Depending on the situation, she could have another dozen identities. India, home to a sixth of all humans, is a very complex place. Soon it will have the world's largest population. China has slightly more, but while China is not as homogeneous as some people think, it is definitely not as heterogeneous or diverse as India is. And I think this line was very important in the book. Even in the US, the world's third largest country by population. If you've gone to New York or Boston or in other Western cities like London, you'll see people of all skin colors, right? All languages. But we say that on closer observation, one finds that diversity in the West is relatively skin deep, not soul deep. SOUL deep. I think that was an interesting point we made. The why? Because the poor Mexican immigrant who causes so much heartburns in some part of America, they do not have a fundamentally different worldview than most Americans. They do not want to change American laws. They are broadly speaking a bit of racial, linguistic, and most interestingly, gastronomical diversity within the same Western heritage. So try to understand when people say comparing Mexican illegal immigrants in the US and say Bangladeshi illegal immigrants in India, they're very, very different takes, because the Bangladeshi illegal immigrant in India might represent a different civilization the way Mexican illegal immigrants in America does not. And this point needs to be understood. Then we quote Thatcher and Donald Trump and other people saying why the West is one civilization. I'll skip that part. So what is the civilization? We call the Indian civilization a civilization of synthesis. For example, the way we say this is, Winston Churchill famously said India is no more a political personality than Europe is. India is a geographical term. It is no more united than the equator. And we say that while the equator flourish is obviously wrong, and this person was clearly racist, because of him, millions of people died in the Bengal famine. But it is true, the hypothesis, it is worth exploring that India is a civilization, but it's still becoming a nation. Because many Indian states do resemble European nations. For example, Punjab and Andhra might be like France and Bulgaria, right? They might have different ethno-linguistic roots, but a common civilizational root. The European Union is the modern secular inheritor of Christendom, just like India is the manifestation of a united Dharmic polity. So what is the catalyst? Now we finally have one united democratic state which represents all of us. We've never had Dharmics. Indians have never had a free state of their own. Definitely not in any democratic format in a modern sense. What Rajeev mentioned about pre-existing democratic culture is absolutely correct in the sense of the republics, the Lichavi Republic and the ancient republics, just the way the West talks about Greek democracy. If that is legitimate in version of democracy today, then because the Greek states had slaves, very few people could vote. In that sense, obviously, Indians also had democracy in ancient times. But in a modern universal adult franchise time, this united democratic all India state is the first we've had. That is the catalyst which is converting our civilization into a nation. And I think this is very interesting. Words civilization and culture get confused. And there is overlap, no doubt, but we'll try to explain why it is different. For example, North India and Pakistan may share a common culture when it comes to food, or at least some parts of food, movies, music, but all such commonalities could not prevent the violent rupture of partition. And as Sunil Khilnani, who wrote The Idea of India, he said that partition was the quote-unquote greatest violation of Gandhi's idea of India as a civilizational unity by quote-unquote irrational forces. So, what we say is what Khilnani is unable to say, because that would cause too much cognitive dissonance, is that India and Pakistan, or a predominant set of Muslim majority areas in the northwest of the Indian subcontinent and perhaps elsewhere, they do not represent one civilization. It may not be politically correct to say, but they represent two civilizations. Indeed, the India-Pakistan border may be the most severe civilizational fault line in the entire world, despite the common culture. That's where we began. Of all the modern states in existence today, India represents the pinnacle of syncretic polytheism. We are right now celebrating Durga Puja in some part of the country, Dashera somewhere else. Even for the Devi, we have different forms, right? It's syncretic polytheism. Whereas Pakistan represents the most unrestrained barbaric instincts of proselytizing monotheism. So all the shairi and all the kebabs and music cannot paper over this reality. And that's the difference between culture and civilization. And obviously, Samuel Huntington had famously talked about the clash of civilizations. But even if you don't believe in a clash of civilizations, you have to at least acknowledge the reality of different civilizations. Now, There is another term of civilization which is not less relevant, is not relevant today, but maybe in coming times, is when we quote Naipaul, when he talked about the incipient universal civilization. He said that there will be a global humane civilization in time to come, but let us see. That is not the situation right now. Yes, so by the way, this India being a syncretic civilization is something that even people like Daniel Patrick Mohian, who was the US ambassador to India, he said the defining strength of India has been its ability to absorb. In fact, he says Indian civilization, the defining strength of that civilization is its ability to absorb synergistically the culture of outsiders, thereby conquering the conquerors. And it has largely been true. I mean, it was clearly not true in the case of Islamic invaders, although even there you can argue to the extent. But for example, the Indo-Greeks, the Indo-Hephthalites, some people say that some of the Rajputs, some of the northwestern communities like Rajputs and Jats, Gujars, it may or may not be true, were partially descendants of Indo-Greeks or Indo-Hephthalites. And what happened is they became part of the larger Hindu polity and culture. And similarly, when we spoke about Pandurang Kane in the last chapter as well, and this is an interesting thing where he goes beyond the definition of dharma into the substance of it. He says the reason given for cultivating virtues such as daya and ahimsa is based on the very simple but complex philosophical doctrine of the one, the self, being present in every individual. And it is said in words, it is best encapsulated in the word Tattvam Asi. He says that is the highest point in Indian metaphysics. It requires us to consider the goodness or badness that happens to us for other people as well, which is known as the golden rule in morality, right? Buddhism also has something similar. And in the West also, out of the traditional religions there, Christianity, etc., you have such metaphysics. Yes, so there's a concept that we need to understand, individual rights and group rights. So what India does is India says, we'll have individual rights for Hindus. For example, uniform civil code, whereby daughters by definition get half, same property as sons do. And there's constant reform, and we are all in support of it. No BJP leadership has ever said to roll it back. In fact, they're trying to make it more and more aggressive. They recently liberalized abortion, except the last trimester. They've been pushing for more inheritance rights. They've even been talking about making the marriage age for men and women the same. Again, people have different views, but clearly there is no question of retrogression from the point of view of the BJP. However, when it comes to for example, Muslim personal law, Nehruvians, and in this case Nehru as well, refused to reform it. And Stephen Wilkinson and many other people, we call this consocialism. It's a tough to pronounce word. Consocialism is basically when we see groups and not just individuals as legitimate entities for power sharing within a politics, within a polity. And a subset of consocialism is confessionalism. Confessionalism is when that group sharing happens along the lines of religion. So, for example, Lebanon is a famous example of confessionalism, where historically you've had a Shia, this, and Sunni president, and a Christian Maronite, some other parliamentary speaker, or what have you. But Stephen Wilkinson, who actually would probably not agree with so-called Hindutvawadis, says that actually since the mid-1960s, as India became more consocial, his research shows there has been an increase in Hindu-Muslim rights, caste conflict, and separatist violence. He says, and I quote him, I argue that there are good reasons to think that consocial policies might even be responsible for the increase in ethnic violence in recent years. So it is not just a philosophical point that we are trying to make, that at least, in society, I can be a Hindu, I can be this or that. I am simply arguing for the state to see me as an individual citizen, as an Indian, only the state. And actually somebody who would disagree with me perhaps politically is saying he agrees with me and Rajeev that this kind of policies by the Nehruvians led to more identity-based violence in India over the last half century. And the final part we'll go is to a section that we wrote called Kashmir, Pakistan, and Karl Popper. And there's a lot of, please buy the book. I'm sorry to plug it, but there's a lot of good stuff that I have to skip for want of time. Okay, so this Kashmir, Pakistan, and Karl Popper. So Karl Popper wrote in his classic work, The Open Society and Its Enemies, that if we want, and I'll just simply quote him, he said, I do not imply, for instance, that we should always suppress intolerant philosophies. As long as we can counter them by rational argument, keep them in check by public opinion, suppression would be wrong and unwise. But we should claim the right to suppress them, if necessary, even by force, And this is to some extent we are actually arguing for almost absolute free speech in another part of the book. But this is an argument which says we must keep the right in future to suppress them, for it may easily turn out that they are not prepared to meet us on the level of rational argument. They may tell that all argument is wrong. For example, the way postmodernists say, they may say it is deceptive, and they say we will fight violently. In that case, we should claim, in the name of tolerance, to not tolerate the intolerant. Why is that relevant? For example, in the case of Kashmir, let us consider Kashmir. Kashmir is a very small part. Kashmir Valley is 4,000 square kilometers out of 222,000 square kilometers of Kashmir, Jammu, and Ladakh. Yet, obviously, it is a bone of contention. What is the bone of contention? Basically, shorn of all logic, Pakistan says a Muslim majority border region. How did it go to India and not Pakistan after partition? Right? It's another point that we completely forgot about Savarkar, but let's not go into that. That is a blot on our humanity, but that's been done, and we need to correct it later on. How should we react? Should we go by the so-called liberal way, or maybe not all liberals believe this, that आप referendum करा दो and छोड़ दो जगह को? Or should we not? Because if we do have a second religion-based partition, what does it mean for minorities in the rest of the country? And this is not just a hypothetical scenario. Demographic changes in Kerala, Bengal, and Assam are showing that we are going in that direction, and we quote a bunch of numbers. So how should we think? And we very quickly compare this secessionist demand in Kashmir to, say, in the West. Please contrast what is happening in Sunni Muslim Kashmir Valley with what is happening in Catalonia, Spain, Scotland in UK, or say Quebec in Canada. In the last three cases, if there is any secession, they will all remain within the West. In fact, in the first two cases, they will remain in the EU. They will have free trade agreements. But whereas in the first case, it will end up going to a hostile civilizational unit. It will be very different from, whereas Quebec, separating is like within the West, a new country is created. It's like we creating Telangana within the Dharmic polity. So that is the conceptually not the same, even though we use the term nation state. And it's very important to look at this point. For example, Northern Ireland, Northern Ireland was historic Catholics, and Ireland, the rest of Ireland, which is with the UK, is Protestants. And they may actually merge soon, partially because of demographic reasons, but partially also because there are no more Christian-based laws in the lived reality of these people. If we come to Pakistan, can we say something similar to that? Let us for a moment see Kashmir as Northern Ireland, Pakistan as Ireland, and India as the UK. First, partition was never about one-to-one mapping of religious demographics. Secondly, Pakistan, unlike the Irish Republic, is nowhere remotely close to secular liberal enlightenment. Hindus, Sikhs, Shias, Muslim liberals, do they really want to join the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, even if they're not in a majority? Would that be fair? Thirdly, even if Pakistan were to go through a secularization process, how do we go by self-determination? They've already sent so many Punjabi Sunni Muslims to Gilgit-Baltistan, and we have not changed the demographics here. We are now trying to change it. And finally, quite simply, just like we kept a part of Punjab, and I think we should have kept a part of Sindh, but we kept Bengal, it is fine to keep a part of Kashmir because it is integral to India's civilizational heritage, thousands of years of Hindu and Buddhist culture. I think I'll just leave it at that and hand over to Rajiv for chapter 3.
So chapter 3 of the book then delves into one of the most contentious sort of issues of debate in contemporary Indian politics, which is secularism, or secularism as it is practiced in India. As many of us know, the whole premise is actually very flawed. It has all kinds of problems, and the most obvious one is that India, even today, continues to have a system of religion-based personal laws for about 20% of its population. So this aspect of having religion-based laws has actually a very interesting history. Back in 1955, Jawaharlal Nehru, when he was a prime minister, he had brought what are today called the Hindu Code Bills to reform and modernize the laws concerning personal matters of Hindus. And when he did it only for Hindus and not for Muslims, J.B. Kripalani, who was a very renowned Gandhian socialist leader, he said, and I quote, "I charge you with communalism because you are bringing forward a law about monogamy only for Hindu community. Take it from me that the Muslim community is prepared to have it, but you're not brave enough to do it. So Kriplani had been a long colleague of Nehru in the Congress, and these were very strong words by him on the floor of Parliament. So why did the as he's called liberal and secular Nehru do this? We may never know. Even today, this issue remains contentious, and we find that a lot of secular aligned parties or other self-described secular parties and politicians support such religion-based laws. It is truly baffling. So, so let me come next to the issue of how secularism is practiced in India. And I will just read a few lines from the book here, where we say political parties belonging to the secular fold have openly doled out government welfare on religious grounds. One can only bluntly describe this practice as bribery, and it has enjoyed the highest judicial endorsement and constitutional protection. This bribery, euphemistically called minority appeasement in popular parlance, saw a dramatic escalation during the Sonia Gandhi Manmohan Singh era, and that escalation has escaped scrutiny and critical commentary. So, that era, as we all know, was from 2004 till 2014, and numerous state governments, as well as the union government, of course, in that period and even over the last 6 years, have continued with this template where public welfare has been given based on religion. So, our view is that this has made a mockery of the principle of secularism, and thus we call it the pseudo secularist fraud in the book. And the title of this chapter concerning all these issues is Secularism, or the title is Saving Secularism from Secularists. So, I will not go into the detailed sort of research we have presented, where we go region by region, government by government, state by state, and highlight instances where even so-called new age leaders like Arvind Kejriwal in Delhi have indulged in this practice. So I will just quote the great Sitaram Goyal, who had written in his book Secular Democracy and Liberal Theocracy. Goyalji wrote, "The concept of secularism, as known to the modern West, is dreaded, derided, and denounced in the strongest terms by the foundational doctrines of Christianity and Islam. It is therefore intriguing that the most fanatical and fundamentalist adherents of Christianity and Islam in India, that is, the Christian missionaries and Muslim mullahs, cry themselves hoarse in defense of Indian secularism." So Goel had seen this as even decades ago, and even in 2020, we continue to see these malpractices, which often don't see any kind of critical commentary in the mainstream media, and unfortunately, they continue to carry on being labeled secular. And those who oppose this are actually, ironically, in a very Orwellian way, called communal. So it is a great tragedy, actually, of modern India that this has carried on for so long. In the same way, there is this movement towards rationalism, we are told. And we know about some of these movements that have been going on in Maharashtra, Karnataka, and other parts of India, where a clique of self described rationalist activists have taken upon themselves to define for other people what is rational, what is irrational. So we address some of their positions in the section titled Saving Rationalism from the Rationalists." And our view is obviously that these activists have no business deciding for other people what is rational, irrational in a free country. If they think something is superstitious, and one person or some people want to practice that superstition, whatever they think is superstitious, the individual has every right to practice that. And who are these people to try to legally bar it or place bans in it, or even worse, criminalize it? So, so these activists have actually tried to usurp government power, through the instrumentality of government power. They usurp that position and try to, in the worst terms possible, even criminalize certain types of individuals for just practicing what they want to practice. Provided, of course, they're not harming anybody. Why should we criminalize people like that? But again, all this is being labeled liberal, secular, and the complete perversion of these words has made it very difficult, actually, for those who are genuinely liberal and secular. And then finally, in this chapter, we come to the issue of free speech, which obviously, everyone has strong views on this subject. Our position is that, except in situations and areas where there are severe security issues, or the region is a war zone or something, our view is that India should embrace near absolute freedom of speech in that sense, including criticism of all religions should be allowed. This is because freedom of expression is the cornerstone of individual rights, as you expounded upon in the book. And interestingly, again, like one of the most interesting parliamentary debates that happened on this issue in the early years of the creation of the Indian Republic was between Shama Prasad Mukherjee, the founder of the Jan Sangh. At that time, he was, I think, a member of the government at that time, if I remember correctly, and between Nehru who wanted to dilute free speech. So the original Constitution of India actually provided for a much broader license of free speech. But then that was whittled down by Nehru through the First Amendment. And SP Mukherjee at that time had said in Parliament that India should have unrestricted, absolute free speech on the lines of what Sweden had. This, of course, requires strong state capacity, which we will discuss in chapter 5. So, on that note, I think we should shift to a discussion on economics, which is obviously key to building state capacity. So, there is a misconception that free markets don't require government, or free markets are anti-government in a sense. I think nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, liberal economy and free markets require a strong but limited state. And on that aspect of liberal economy, free markets, I will now hand over to Harsh to talk about all the sort of economic policy related issues.
Thank you so much, Rajeev. We are now on chapter 4. The book has 5 chapters. So, chapter 4 is called Profit is Not a Dirty Word. That is obviously in reference to what very famously, or rather infamously, Nehruji had told J.R.D. Tata, that Jay, don't talk to me about profit. Profit is a dirty word. When J.R.D. Tata had brought up about the profitability, or rather the loss making of the public sector units. And then I think recently somebody was very kind enough to share an interview of J.R.D. Tata on YouTube. And I think we all saw it, at least we saw parts of it. And then she said that, Nehruji and Indira Gandhi had kind of developed a nice technique that whenever he would talk about markets or economics, they would start looking out of the window. And, that was the end of discussion. He understood that they do not want to discuss that. So we obviously say emphatically that profit is not a dirty word. No economy can run without profit. We have this kind of moral hypocrisy about profits. It has significantly reduced, but it is not fully gone. For example, in the case of our schools and colleges, we still try to keep them non-profit, but obviously profits are made, albeit in an illegal manner, and people who benefit are not smart educational entrepreneurs, although now hopefully it will change with EdTech, but people who are connected with politicians, people who are connected with local bureaucrats. And they show it as non-profit, but they know how to siphon off money from these trusts. And so what eventually happens because of this hypocrisy, you end up creating cronyism and corruption. Human incentives don't change. And in fact, capitalism in that sense is not so much an economic system. It is actually a political human system, which does not mean it should not be unregulated. It very much should be regulated, but it recognizes the primacy of human incentives. And there are a few parts of the chapter 4. One is morality of markets. Second is practical case of markets. So the first is more of a normative case. The second is more of a practical, technocratic case. Third part is India's digital transformation. Then is misfits, rebels, troublemakers. The fifth part is what we call market feminism and Dalit entrepreneurship. And the last part is Atmanirbhar capitalism. Because time is short, I'll skip the first two parts, which makes a more conventional case for market incentives. And I'll go to India's digital transformation, which I think is very interesting. The way we kind of, because it's also it's something new in the sense of what's happening with technology right now. So, for example, as we've argued, India is transforming from a civilization to a nation through a state. We've already argued that. The state is penetrating deeper into all sections of society, which have been long accustomed to disparate existence. That, like 100 years ago, many families did not have a last name. So, like based on your caste or gotra or your region, once you came to the cities, you ended up giving yourself a name. I definitely know that happened in my family's case. That's why you also see the Junjunwalas who are from Junjunu and so on and so forth. And there is a famous scholar we kind of quote because of, in this context from Yale University called James C. Scott, and his concept of legibility. In his book, Seeing Like a State, How Certain Schemes to Improve the Human Condition Have Failed. So he says the pre-modern state was in many aspects blind. It knew little about its subjects, their wealth, their lands, their yields, agricultural yields, their location, their very identity. So when we say modernity, there are many connotations, and some people don't like the word because they think it means westernization. But at least in this book, we are definitely not using the word like that at all. What in the case of a modern state, what it simply means is the state, hopefully an accountable state like India, as opposed to a non-accountable state like China's. An accountable state like India should be able to see a citizen's basic transactions while respecting privacy, so that they can be taxed properly, so that they can make sure that nothing wrong or illegal is happening. And this is what is happening because of, for example, the Aadhaar, and which Rajeev and I suspect, we don't directly write that in the book, which is one of the reasons why a lot of people oppose the Aadhaar, because they do not want the Indian state to be capable and competent and non-corrupt to do welfare smartly and efficiently, because they're really afraid of the Indian state having the power to do so. So this digital transformation has made transferring money in India probably much easier than many developed countries. Both Rajeev and I, like many of you, have probably lived, worked, studied, or at least traveled outside of India. And transferring money from bank to bank in India is much simpler than in some economies you would think would be much more advanced, including the United States and Singapore, at least till recently. And this has allowed India the possibility to leapfrog through its digital soft infrastructure into a very smart welfare state and higher productivity. And we talk about the JAM Trinity. What is the JAM Trinity? J is for the JAM Trinity is A is for Aadhaar, M is for mobile phone, and J is for the banks, which have been opened for the poorest people. 300 or 400 million bank accounts have opened in the last 6 years. So now everybody has a bank account. Most Indian adults have a bank account. Most of them have a phone, even if they don't have a smartphone. And all of them now effectively have a unique identification. And therefore, you can do something like cash transfers, which was done when the pandemic started this year. We still don't have full databases. We have database of all the Aadhaar IDs, but we don't have databases of their income. So targeted welfare is still difficult, but at least universal welfare, if somebody were to decide that politically, can be done, which could not have been done even 5 years ago. And just imagine, because I've actually worked in Rajasthan villages and Delhi slums about 10 years ago for MIT Poverty Action Lab. I've seen schemes like Narega, and I've seen villagers be asked for and give bribes at the local rural post office to get their 100 rupees per day khata. Whatever their amount is now, it's probably more than 100 rupees. And they had to pay 30-40% of the amount as a bribe. So this is huge. Whether, as Rajeev rightly mentioned, you need the state and you need markets both. And we need a smaller state, but in terms of some areas where it's overreaching, but where it exists, we definitely need a competent state, and that is what technology is allowing it. And luckily, India is one of the first countries to own it. So I'll quickly go to the next section, which says misfits, rebels, and troublemakers. I think this is very interesting. It kind of goes along with the theme of the book of individual rights in a civilizational state. Ultimately, all individuals are unique. And what happened till 10, 20 years ago, all middle class parents would tell their children, please become an engineer or a doctor or go to IAS. Otherwise, it's very difficult for you to have an upper middle class lifestyle in a corrupt India, in a poor India. And from the parents' point of view, 15, 20 years ago, they were not necessarily wrong. Statistically, they were right. But what increasingly, and this is only accelerate further, a prosperous economy, has allowed is people. I know people who are making money, organizing legal poker tournaments. There are people who are RJs. There are people who are DJs, who are actors, and which they are making as much money as any middle class or upper middle class professional. And that misfit, rebel, and troublemaker is only possible within a capitalist system. It's not possible in a socialist system. If in a socialist system, the political power at the top is always most powerful. If you've seen a movie like The Lives of Others, I think about East Germany, it shows you the dystopia. So we kind of quote about that. We quote about, Bollywood used to have a very socialist view in the 1960s and 70s. And as we are seeing on Twitter, they also had many anti-Hindu attitudes. But you're seeing even that is now changing and is responding to people's awareness and their pocketbooks and their market incentives. It's not fully changed, it's gradually changing. I think there is a good quote that Rajiv and I have put from the American artist Andy Warhol, which says, the beauty of capitalism is the US president drinks Coke, Liz Taylor drinks Coke, and just think you can drink Coke too. It's the same damn Coke. And that's the kind of standardization and economies of scale that capitalism brings. I think this market feminism and Dalit entrepreneurship is very interesting because people say that this right-wing Hindus and right-wing economists want to suppress women and Dalits. Actually, market feminism has done much more for female independence, including financial independence, than what is known as Marxist feminism. Marxist feminism has only created university jobs. It has not created any real private sector jobs. It is only an expanding economy that allows hitherto suppressed sections to have their own financial independence. He quote copiously from an US economist called Gary Becker, who wrote many papers famously about how discrimination in a competitive economy hurts people who are discriminating. And we give a very good example where there is less competition. For example, the Hindu newspaper, which pretends to be liberal in Chennai, has some different policies in its own premises. But as far as there is market competition for Indian multinationals, they have to change their policies, including their own dining policies internally. So we give many examples of how competition makes people, even if I don't agree with a certain habit or a certain view, if I am operating in a competitive segment of the economy, I cannot afford to discriminate because then I will lose out on talent that my competitor will go and take. And we actually show that, for example, Indian Muslims are not discriminated against in the IT sector because the IT sector is very competitive. So the 5 or 6 out of 7 sections of the book of this particular chapter or chapter 4 are for free markets. This is the only section in which we make a case partially against free markets, against free trade unilaterally and absolutely. And that also goes along with this entire concept of individual rights in a civilizational state, where we say individual rights is akin, as Rajiv mentioned, akin to skepticism and akin to free markets domestically. But what is the civilizational state part in it? Can India leverage its size to get more investment and industrialize quicker by having, for example, good domestic infrastructure, good integrated markets through GST for all its faults, but having moderate time-bound tariffs, which tells multinationals, you only make in India. For example, Hyundai or Suzuki. But if you make in India, you will not have to pay so much tariffs, and then you can export out of India as well. And because of your size, you start attracting supply chains in a way that a Sri Lanka or a Bangladesh cannot. And Atmanirbhar capitalism, we say free market is very good, but we should not be completely opposed to the idea of some industrial policy or some activist trade policy. Because right now, what happens is industries tend to agglomerate in one geography. First, it was Japan, then it was Korea, now China, and even Vietnam is doing very well because it is right next to southern China, which is near Guangdong and Hong Kong and all those industrialized areas. It's easy for the Chinese entrepreneurs to go. Culturally, they're similar areas. Bangladesh is doing very well. We are discussing because Bangladesh has some kind of export exemptions or preferential tariff treatment from European Union and other people in the West, which India does not have. Now, that might be part of our geopolitical and diplomatic work to do, but those comparisons are wrong for India, not only because India is larger, but many of the situations don't apply. India should not be export pessimistic, but it will have to leverage its domestic market, not just for industry, but going forward, I suspect for these big internet giants as well. Remember the case of Paytm when it was going against Google a month ago because Google banned Paytm of its Android app store for one reason or the other. And Paytm said, well, let's make our own India app store. That may happen. It may not happen soon. It may happen through some other Indian company with some Indian government help. But at some point in the digital economy with winner takes all, we cannot allow, in the name of free markets, all the profits to be in California, right? So there is something to be said about smart leveraging of your size without making your economy inefficient. And just because it is difficult to do is not a good excuse to not try it at all. So that's the concept of Atmanirbhar capitalism. We would still like free trade with the West, which is geopolitically friendly. But people who are arguing for unilateral free trade should need to understand the geopolitical and geo-economic threat that China presents, communist China, the way Rajiv and I have described in detail in this book. And hence, you cannot have free trade with a country that is literally your enemy, right? There's a reason why we don't trade with Pakistan as well. So I would leave it at that. We quote Alexander Hamilton and many other people showing that actually some tariffs work very well. America throughout the 19th century had 40% weighted average tariffs on imported finished goods. It only became free trader once it became dominant industrially itself. And that's what actually all the countries have done historically: UK, Germany, India, Japan, and now Japan, Korea to a lesser extent because they could export to America. They were treaty allies. And now China. Now China is talking about free trade because it has excess industrial capacity, right? So those are interesting issues to just keep in mind, and we should not be quote unquote religious about any economic doctrine. Broadly speaking, free markets and incentives work, but they have to work for the Indian civilizational state. And on speaking on the state, how do we decolonize it? How do we make its administrative system better? Is the last chapter. We'll try to do quickly. It's called Decolonizing the Indian State. I'll hand it over to Rajiv, chapter 5.
Thank you, Harsh. Intimately connected with the performance of the economy is having a focused, restructured government and state. And obviously, state includes even the judiciary and in overall sense. So what is the challenge that India faces here? Obviously, a lot of people feel that there is too much government in India. We need to get rid of government. Well, the issue really is that we have too much government in the wrong areas and too little government in the areas that matter to sustain growth, to enable growth. So let me quote from the book where we write, in the long run, without an effective state, growth is impossible. A strong state is a necessary but not sufficient condition. For growth to be sustained, the state has to be restrained while still being effective in specific areas. India's problem is having state flab in the wrong places in the government and no muscle in areas that matter. There are bloated ministries in the center as well as in the states, but many vacancies in departments entrusted with actually executing critical programs and policies. The Indian bureaucracy is too generalist. So, what is the proper role of government? In a nutshell, government is there to provide security, defense, welfare for the poorest and neediest sections of the population. And beyond that, really, we have to question whether government should own hotels, run an airline, run myriad companies in industries like steel and power, because all these activities actually defocus from this proper role of government. And in the fifth chapter, titled Decolonizing the Indian State, in a very expansive way, we talk about all these kind of administrative governance issues, touching upon nearly every single aspect of governance. So one consistent theme, important sort of very critical part of chapter 5, which we make, and we hope that that message is sort of absorbed by all readers, is that administrative reform is so critical today in India that we can no longer ignore it. So today, what we find is a government job is a job for life. Senior officers are selected, or they are finding themselves in the high posts that they have based on a generalist comparative examination, which they had taken some decades ago, even as the world is getting more and more specialist. And there is a lack of sheer numbers, where certain types of roles and responsibilities are simply understaffed in India dramatically. Take the strength of the Indian Foreign Service pool. So these are the officers who are India's diplomats, who are India's representatives, ambassadors in foreign countries. And to quote some statistics from the book, India has just 2,700 staff members and 912 foreign service officers. Countries like China with 4,500, Japan with 5,700, France with 6,000, and the US with 20,000 are way ahead. In fact, in India, we are literally every year taking just a few dozen new IFS officers. So there is a need to dramatically increase the intake because there is actually a shortage of diplomats and ambassadors and skilled sort of personnel in this field. So an overhaul systemic change is required actually on the administrative side. What we need is lateral entry and some component of variable performance based pay for those who are in the middle and higher ranks. There is a need to have higher pay in cash and a reduced pay in kind for such officers and bureaucrats. What we find today is, the even the cabinet secretary of India, for example, is probably paid something like I think it's the number is something close to 3 lakhs a month. But then there's an array of benefits that come with that. You get the bungalow in Delhi, you get certain staff kind of emoluments and so on and so forth. So our case is that it's probably better to have higher cash compensation and a lower in-kind compensation, so that actually we know what is the true cost that we are paying, and actually the true cost is even more distorted when we assess entry-level jobs in government. So the pay and benefits that an entry-level official manages to get in government is disproportionately higher than what they would get in the private sector, which is why we routinely see headlines in the media that there is a recruitment going on for some low level officer posts and tens of thousands of people are applying for it. Obviously the media spins it as some kind of unemployment problem, but the truth is that those who are able to get in to these jobs have a job for life. Not much work is expected to be done from such officers in these posts, and you see your pay and kind of benefits going up almost for sure for many decades to come, which is why these jobs are in demand. So let me quote again a short passage to emphasize this point, because I think this is known as it should be. So, and I quote from the book: this disproportionately high pay granted to lower levels compared to the market rate for similar jobs in the private sector distorts the labor market. It wastes the youth of tens of millions of people who keep trying their luck to somehow land a government job with its lifelong job security and multiple non-cash perks. Even the cash component at the lower levels is higher than the comparable private sector jobs. The result is that advanced degree holders are applying in tens of thousands for entry level posts. So then let's shift gears away from administrative reform towards topics of education and health. Due to paucity of time, let me just summarize that really quickly, because I want to talk more about the judicial aspect of governance reform. So in education and health, we know about the issues posed by the Right to Education Act, which is kind of discriminatory towards those of one religion and kind of doesn't affect those in the minority religion and so on. So there is an apt case to reform that. We have to treat all Indians as equal, irrespective of what religion or what group they come from. And in a broader sense too, there is a need to accept that education too is a profit-making activity. So closing our eyes and pretending that no one should make any money in education, well, that is not a practical thing. It is better to regulate. It is better to sort of place certain types of maybe rules and requirements for those who are in the education business, rather than pretending that everything is non-profit. And on the health side, as we're going through a pandemic, we're all realizing, I think, the importance of public health, the importance of investment in public health. And we make a detailed case and present some detailed models on achieving efficiency, expanding coverage, and all of that in the book. So let me jump quickly to the section on judicial reforms. So this too has been a contentious sort of area for the last, especially for the last 6 years, since there's been a change in government with the exit of the Congress, entry of the BJP, where the judiciary is seen by certain groups, certain activist groups, as kind of a buffer against the government. And this whole aspect of the basic structure doctrine has been made some kind of a untouchable, unchangeable, immutable thing. Uh, and but to take a step back from that, the fundamental issue I think today with the judiciary is the selection system. We talked about the selection system for senior officials and top bureaucrats. The selection system for the judiciary is even more opaque and non-transparent. Even some people would argue not very meritocratic, because India is one of the few countries in the world where the judges actually appoint themselves. So the system that we have is a collegium system where the judges decide who will be the chief justice of a high court, who will get to be a Supreme Court judge, and so on. So what is necessary is actually uh, changing that, and there was an attempt to change it 5 years ago with the creation of the National Judicial Appointments Commission, the NJAC. But then the creation of that itself was shot down by the judges on the ground that is against the basic structure. So this basic structure is actually a very interesting concoction where anything that the judges believe is sort of a part of the basic structure becomes a part of the basic structure. There seems to be no consistent kind of laid down in black and white criteria to say that this is a part of the basic structure of the constitution, and thus it is a part of what judges can or cannot strike down, versus them having kind of an arbitrary control on that aspect. So changing the selection system somewhere and evolving strong first principles and taking a first principles based approach uh, is actually very important for even economic growth, because often in many cases we find that there is a certain arbitrariness and that affects like investment sentiment. There was the infamous case of one fine day the Supreme Court banned having I think alcohol serving establishments near a national highway, and they said that within some few kilometers or whatever you can't have a alcohol serving establishment. And then that sent the entire hotel and restaurant industry, for example some of them which were near the highway in Gurgaon, and Gurgaon, because of its location, is near national highways, so all those establishments are scurrying around trying to find a way around it. State governments are passing laws redesignating certain highways as state highways so that they don't have to comply with the Supreme Court guideline. And then all this happens, and then one finally the Supreme Court says, okay, never mind, we take it back. So it just kind of reduces the confidence of the public in the judiciary. On what basis are these decisions being made? One fine day they say something, the next day, next few months later they say something else. And the other infamous case was that of the singing the national anthem. So the court decides one day that everyone must stand up when the national anthem is played, or rather, they require the national anthem to be played in cinema halls, and they say that everyone has to stand up. And then obviously there's outrage, there is criticism actually of not the court per se, but actually the government, because some people think this is some nationalist agenda being pushed by the government of India. So all kinds of outrage happens, and then after some months, the court says, "Okay, never mind. Now we don't need to do it. Why should people wear patriotism on their sleeves?" The judges proclaim. So the episodes like this just kind of take away from the kind of gravitas of the court, which is not a good thing for the Indian state, which is not a good thing for our democracy. So something to introspect there, I think, for the judiciary. And I think evolving those first principles based on which the judicial pronouncements are made, as well as improving the selection system, correcting the selection system for the judges. These two reforms are absolutely critical, both to get some kind of balance into the system, as well as not causing economic damage, to be honest. So with the economic liberalization measures that Harsh talked about, that are covered in Chapter 4, and the governance reform measures of Chapter 5, India is going to be a freer, richer nation. I think we are building a modern, industrial, knowledge-based economy, and when there is knowledge and money, power is going to follow. India will be a force to reckon with on the world stage. So then the question becomes, what do we do with this power? What do we use this for, or what do we not use this for equally? And as we were researching this book and going through different kinds of opinions expressed on this issue, Harsh and I were both very amused to learn that some intellectuals in India have actually written at length on why India cannot and must not be a superpower. There were actually academic seminars held on this topic. India must not be a superpower, which we thought was actually an absurd kind of a view, because given its sheer size, given the population, India obviously is 1/6 roughly of humanity. India will be a very important, great power in on the world stage in the 21st century. And why shouldn't it be? Just by force of democratic numbers, if you're a sixth of humanity, you should have a say in how the world is run, in how global affairs are conducted. And I think what India will bring to the table, will bring to the world, is a message of universalism, as captured by the Hindu prayer, Sarve Bhavantu Sukhina. So, on that note, let me hand over to Harsh now to talk at length on what we cover in the concluding chapter of the book. Harsh, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rajeev. It's the conclusion. The chapters are over now. So I'll just quickly read this aspect. As JNU political scientist, this is from the conclusion called India's Moment. As JNU political scientist Ajay Gudavarti observed, the quote-unquote Hindutva brand of politics seems to be one step ahead and he's not a pro-Hindutva person, by the way, in articulating the idea of justice for all, which should have ideally come from those championing secularism and more so from the religious minorities themselves. And this is one of those things which makes it so fascinating to observe India and all that stuff. So it's very fascinating the way Indian politics is evolving. Even beyond debates on how the republic should evolve, the very notion that India is a civilizational entity has surprisingly come to be contested. Hearing a petition against the use of the Sanskrit mantra Asato Ma Sadagame, which means please lead me from unreality to reality, in the Kendriya Vidyalayas, the court had a case and it said the petition raised, quote, questions of seminal importance about our interpretation of Article 28, Section 1 of the Constitution, which says no religious instruction shall be provided to any educational institution by state fund. Now, forget all the madrasas and the Christian schools which are getting taxpayers' money, ignoring even that hypocrisy. To this, the Solicitor General of India, Tushar Mehta, pointed out that the shloka from the Upanishads was not necessarily religious in nature. You cannot compare Dharmic religions to Abrahamic religions. And he added the Supreme Court's own motto, Yato Dharmos Tato Jaya, is actually from the Mahabharata. And so just imagine, there is a confusion about what is our culture and civilization in West. Till fairly recently, and Rajeev and I have mentioned this multiple times, we had this concept called great courses in the colleges. They used to take Homer, Iliad, Odyssey. They would understand their own civilizational heritage. Even an atheist in the UK called Richard Dawkins says you cannot understand English culture and language without studying King James Bible. And in India, we've not studied even the Gita, forget the rest of the Mahabharata, in our schools. We know what we know through our grandmothers, through the internet, through talking to each other. Whereas in the late 1960s, the Congress-led union government, Indira Gandhi is the prime minister then, when she started the Raw Agency, she gave it the motto of Dharmo Rakshati Rakshataha. That is the motto of the Research and Analysis Wing, which is India's external intelligence agency. So clearly the Supreme Court and the Raw and other parts of the other Indian institutions have mottos with the word dharma in it. But now in 2020, it is seen as a right-wing Hindu thing. It's very interesting how this has shifted. Which is why we say the right-wing and left-wing words do not make any sense to us. We are just reclaiming which we think is central to Indian civilization. Again, we have illustrations from Ramayana and Mahabharata in the original copy of the Indian Institution that again illustrates the point that this is not right and left. So this combination of pseudo-secularism and socialist economics exacerbates our divisions. So first, through socialist economics, you make sure everybody's poor. Then people fight on the few resources. In the fighting, you say, okay, you will get it based on your community, and then you fight more based on that identity because there is not enough for us as individuals to go get what we get. And then that's just a vicious cycle. But what we are saying is India has finally broken out of this. We call it a moment of singularity. We call it a virtuous cycle. There is a book about Warren Buffett called The Snowball. A snowball is basically an ice ball that becomes larger and larger as it goes down the mountain. And I think that virtuous cycle has started for India. The so-called leftist progressives confront an intellectual singularity because they have little moral and intellectual room to go to a space that is not occupied already. The right has taken ownership of all the ideas of justice and development. Citizens of all backgrounds are seeing through this spurious liberalism and pseudo-secularism. Narendra Modi set a national aspiration that no Indian Prime Minister has set so far when he said in 2015 that India should aim to be a $20 trillion economy. Yes, in moments of crisis, to some people, such talk may seem facetious. But for too long, India has been a nation of unfulfilled greatness. And as Rajiv mentioned, the idea that we should be strong, that we should be powerful, that we should be rich, not that we will not be, that's a separate debate. That we should be is also told that it is wrong, it is somehow illegitimate, it is immoral. That kind of self effacedness is what India has firmly rejected. This is the context that we find as we approach 75 years of independence. The government has taken long overdue reforms. On the economic side, much has been happened, and so on the civilizational side as well. Now, what has happened is with India having experienced some prosperity, the middle class, or the neo middle class, as some people call it, has become a very strong backer of this kind of politics, and hence another point in support of the virtuous cycle thesis. This tide of heightened aspirations has created a singularity exerting insurmountable forces that are crushing and inescapable. Without deep introspection, the cynics long accustomed to shaping India's image will be unable to emerge from their obscurity. What India has achieved is through the civilizational state, it will give rise to a new universalism without homogenizing humanity. There are other universalisms which want to homogenize humanity. India's is the only universalism which does not want to homogenize humanity, that is best encapsulated in the word dharma, which is the basis of our civilizational state. As a well-known prayer in India goes, and the last section of the last chapter, which Rajiv had read out, was known as Saraswati, Durga, and Lakshmi. Knowledge, power, and prosperity, and that is especially important to keep in mind today, given the festivals that we are celebrating and the goddesses that we're worshipping today. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha, Sarve Santu Niramaya. And we translate that for those who do not understand Hindi or Sanskrit. Om, may all become happy, may all be healthy, may all see what is auspicious, may no one suffer in any way. Om, peace, peace, peace. This summary of our civilization does not see as us versus them. It is not saying only those who believe in these goddesses should be happy. It is saying everybody should be happy and may no one suffer in any way. At the same time, those who do adharma, as the goddess Durga shows, she's also not hesitant in using violence against them. And I think that is the right balance and the right note to end the readout of the book on. And we're very happy to take your questions. Over to you, Rahul.
Thank you very much, Harsh, Rajiv. Brilliant talk, very enlightening. So I'll start with my questions first. Perhaps to Rajiv, I guess, or maybe Harsh. So we have a wonderful talk, by the way, on judicial reform by Advocate Anand Prasad. He's a corporate lawyer, and very, very insightful talk. You may want to watch it. I'll send it on WhatsApp. But this basic structure business, we're not going to be able to change it because even the parliament cannot legislate against the basic structure of the constitution, supposedly. So I don't know, how do we solve this conundrum?
I'll take a stab at it. So on basic structure, actually, as it's a lawyer scholar who happens to be my wife, Akhi Ghosh, she has written extensively on this. And you're right, if you go by the basic structure doctrine, by definition, you cannot replace the basic structure doctrine or modify it or change it, because the claim of the basic structure doctrine is that the judiciary can nullify even a supermajority, that's a constitutional amendment, passed with say 2/3 majority and with the state's assent. But at some point, which is why we mentioned that the basic structure doctrine is not either narrowed down or completely got rid of, but it can also be narrowed down or made more consistent by the court itself, it will lead to a constitutional crisis. Because if just imagine, as Rajiv alluded to, NJAC, it was passed in 2015, the National Judicial Appointments Commission, which said that unlike all democracies, you guys can't just appoint yourselves. Okay, there has to be some kind of bipartisan political, that is the people who are actually elected, some accountability and check. For example, the way it happens in the US, and you can have a different approach. That's fine. But and you can, for example, the Supreme Court could have said in the NJAC there is not enough safeguard for the opposition politician, or there is not enough safeguard for the judiciary. They could have talked about the numbers. They did not fine tune it. They did not modify it. They simply rejected it and said the collegium system which they've invented through 2 or 3 rulings over the decades, they said that what will remain. And I think obviously it was the first term, the first couple of years of Modi government, and they decided not to take it ahead. Remember, it was passed by all parties and all states. They decided not to fight on that. Right now, obviously, a lot has happened with 370 and CAA. So I think we are in the early stages, but I have no doubt that there will be an intellectual pushback against it because there is no consistency. Imagine the basic structure doctrine comes, says fundamental rights cannot be abrogated, but the private property is no longer a fundamental right in India, whereas private property was a fundamental right in the original constitution. The word socialism and secularism was brought in during the emergency, which is an euphemism for dictatorship created by Indira Gandhi for 2 years. And now we are told that something which was passed when the opposition politicians were in jails cannot even be removed by a supermajority constitutional amendment. That does not make sense anywhere by any common sense of the word. The only reason why it has gone so far is because nobody has attacked it. And historically, the court, I don't think it would be unfair to say it. And in any case, now if we get if the court goes against us, you have to pay 1 rupee now. That is the new benchmark to speak against the court, as Prashant Bhushan ji has done it for us. So it would not be unfair to say that the courts have had a leftist bias, and there are some people in the broader Congress or center-left ecosystem, so to speak, who want to use the judiciary as a weapon to nullify what the popular majority wants. And once again, I say there is something called a basic law in Germany, but UK does not even have a written constitution. US has judicial accountability or judicial activism only against laws, not against constitutional amendments. But even if you want to have a basic law or a basic structure, you have to keep it very minimal. You have to keep it, say, for example, elections must happen on time. That basic rights of life will be prevented. You cannot have it an expansive view where in the basic structure, Hindu schools under RTE have quotas even if they don't take 1 paisa from the government, but Muslim and Christian schools are exempt from these regulations even if they get all the money from the government. This just completely is absolutely abhorrent of any common sense. You don't have to be right or left to understand this. So I don't think it will last. I think if the court does not in due course of time back off, it will lead to a constitutional crisis, and that will not be in anybody's favor. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. I have 2 more questions before I'll pass the baton to.
And just to add, Rahul, on that, just very quickly. So in the book, for example, we've quoted from 3 of probably I would say the 3 most kind of eminent authorities on law and particularly constitutional law of India, Dr. Ambedkar, H.M. Sirvai, and Nani Palkhiwala. So if you see particularly their views on the insertion of socialist and secular, or in Ambedkar's case, he had talked about why we should not have such kind of prescriptions inside the constitution. There is no equivocation there. They are very clear that this is not reasonable. I mean, how can the constitution permanently enshrine something which is a matter of policy that is for an elected government to decide? So there are so many problems with this kind of a concoction that Harsh is, I think he's correct when he says that if the judiciary digs in, there will be a face-off sooner or later.
Thank you. Harsh, question for you. You mentioned civilization, culture and civilization are 2 different things. Very powerful insight. I've also not had these arguments. I mean, we don't have these narratives to counter the kebab and shared language business sometimes. So thank you for this insight, right? Does India have 2 civilizations currently within it? And if yes is your answer, how do we deal with it?
Yes, I think it would be fair to say that there is the 200 million Muslims in India, and I would not make the mistake of saying all of them belong to the Islamic civilization. I would be very careful of saying something like that, because there is a genuine spectrum of views. But I would say that there are a large number, it could be plurality, it could be majority, do share a worldview that can be described as civilizational, that looks towards the rest of the Islamic civilization, that if it was within its power, it would have more and more Sharia laws, and it would be fundamentally antithetical to the way we are, not just as a constitutional democracy, but as a civilizational republic as well. So when people say, "Acha, aap to two nation theory ki baat kar rahe hain, Jinnah ne bhi ye baat kari thi." See, my answer to that is very simple. If there are two people and one person does not want to stay within your framework, and you simply recognize that, then you are not responsible for the other person's framework. You are only acknowledging it. You are not creating the other person's framework. So I'm just simply saying that the central message of Orthodox Islam, and to some extent, even Orthodox Christianity, these two global proselytizing religions, is that non-believers go to hell. That there is in the case of Islam, they use the word kafir. In the case of Christianity, they use the word heathen. And that is, again, not all Muslims and Christians believe in it. They might have their own heterodox interpretations of the religion. So it's important to separate those two. But there is certainly a residual Islamic civilizational worldview within India. It is explained in the sense, for example, Jamaat-e-Islami has now 4 parts, one in Pakistan, one in Bangladesh, one in Kashmir, and one in the rest of India. And their apologists say that only the Jamaat-e-Islami Hind, India, has had a ideological involution, and they stand for secularism. Conveniently, Jamaat-e-Islami Pakistan, Jamaat-e-Islami Bangladesh, and Jamaat-e-Islami Kashmir, they've not had ideological involution. Now, just imagine how convenient that is, because within an Indian majority case, within an Indian Hindu or Dharmic majority case, that is the situation where they want to actually get by saying that secularism, in their definition of allowing soft Sharia, is something good. So I think there is a clear hypocrisy there. So the answer is yes, and that it remains a challenge for us how to integrate that. And the reason the challenge is harder is because there is a clear demographic trend as well, which we have to discuss separately. It's a massive issue by itself.
And I'll also just add quickly to that. So, there are, even within so-called minorities, there are minorities, right? There is a sub-minority within a larger minority. But in the current construct we have in India right now, those minorities within minorities are actually told by the state that, no, you can't think like that. You have to think like this. So we are kind of, the government itself is forcing even the heterodox thinkers to go towards orthodoxy. And that is why it is so important to have individual rights front and center.
In the Hindu Charter, one of the leaders of the movement, the ideological leaders of the movement, I won't name him, retired officer, IPS officer, he actually says that India is an apartheid state. And, you are actually incentivizing, also Sankrant Sanu says the same thing, we incentivize conversion or the movement towards radicalism and orthodoxy in some ways. My final question for a comment from either one of you. A lot of our side of people, right, left, I don't know how you want to define it, conservative, if you like, economic conservatives, as Jerry Rao would put it in one of our talks, in the Indian conservative. Some would argue that the Modi government itself is extremely socialist. Your comments?
Okay, I'll take a stab at it first. I think, as Rajeev and I mentioned, this state versus market dichotomy is not how it actually works on the ground. If it was the reality, as I often say, Somalia would be the most prosperous country in the world. Okay? Somalia has no state. Whereas some of the most prosperous and most livable areas in the world are places like, say, Sweden, Canada, Switzerland, America. And they have very extensive governments, but they're also extremely market friendly and business friendly. You can argue about the level of taxation and redistribution, but opening a business, running a business, closing a business, doing trade, very, very easy. So that what happens is, in a market, you need somebody to be a facilitator. You need somebody to literally create the market, the rules of the game, standardize weights and measurements, have a good contractual judicial system, make sure there is good state capacity and policing capacity. Nobody comes and extorts from your factory. These state capacity and market entrenchment go hand in hand. What Narendra Modi has done in the first term, and then I'll come to the second term. For example, if you're creating rural roads, and to be fair, other governments have also created it, but if you add on to that LPG, if you add on to that electrification last mile, And now in the second term, if you add on to that drinkable, potable water in every household by 2024, that is the aim. You are bringing onto the market with basic human capacities, maybe hundreds of millions of more people. How is that not a pro-market move? Because you're literally expanding the market for so many Indian entrepreneurs. And to add on to that, that is not just the Indian government's move, but that's also driven by technology, not just UID, but for example, the geo phenomenon. It's a private sector phenomenon. But India today has the cheapest data rates in the whole world, and an average Indian on a per person per day basis downloads and uses more mobile cell phone data than an average American. And imagine the kind of, for example, this Zoom seminar that we are doing in the middle of a pandemic is possible because of technology. And you don't have to be a multimillionaire to have access to this technology. That is now, people don't even need a laptop. They can do it on their phone. Even the phone doesn't need to be that fancy. So the booming of Amazons and Flipkarts and Swiggies and Zomatos and Ubers and Olas, we can argue about how much Indianization it should happen or not. There is a clear ownership. There's an improvement in ease of living, along with the ease of business rankings that the Modi government has achieved. So similarly, GST creates an integrated market. There are some issues that we discuss in the book, but it's 90% a positive. IBC is something that allows exiting of businesses. You cannot have capitalism without exit. Something that, somebody who we all know and respect, somebody like Sanjeev Sanyal, principal economic advisor, he worked very hard on the IBC aspect of it. And it's not just a law, because you have to work very hard in creating the new quasi-judicial structure, the IBC professionals. There needs to be some precedents in court. There is a lot of soft legal infrastructure that needs to be created. It takes time. So now imagine, because of the IBC, your debt recovery improves. So if a company goes bad, as a bondholder of the company, if I got 10 paisa on a rupee, now I can get 40 paisa on a rupee. If I got it in 5 years, I can now get it in 2 or 3 years. Therefore, the bond market improves. Therefore, there are competition for banks to lend at better rates. So the entire architecture is being created. It is different. So it's only land, labor, and capital is not factor market reforms. And even there, we've done labor reforms in the second term, which I'm coming to now. We've done capital market reforms by having REITs and InvITs, real estate and investment infrastructure trusts, which again bring a lot of foreign patient capital. So the plumbing of the Indian economy has dramatic, and nothing like this was done in 10 years of UPA 1 and UPA 2. Now, the reason the critique comes is because the growth rates, especially in the last couple of years, have not been so high. So I don't blame the common person. The common person बोल रहा है इतना अच्छा हो रहा है तो मेरा growth क्यों नहीं हो रहा, right? And that's a fair question to ask. But the point is, a lot of these growths not only have a delayed lag in terms of showing results. In fact, in some cases, they are short-term deflationary. There's something called a J curve. In the short term, they actually lead to contraction. Rajeev has independently also written about it, both on a structural and technological basis. So we have to be patient. And the final point is the global macro point. India is not alone. The last 8 or 9 years have been a strong dollar phase. Whenever the dollar is strong, emerging economies grow slowly. Most of the UPA phase was a weak dollar phase. Whenever the dollar is weak, emerging economies grow faster. I personally think by 2021, we'll be permanently in the next few years, in a weaker dollar phase. And therefore, I'm very optimistic, not just an economist, as a commentator, as a writer, but as an investor who has my money, my clients' money, my company's money on the line, that we will see significant growth come back. I have said $5 trillion by FY25 and $12 trillion by FY31. And I stick with those targets that some people think are ludicrously optimistic. Rajeev, do you want to add something to it?
No, I'll just say two things. One is, to really summarize what Harsh has said, there are two words for it: state creation. So what Narendra Modi is doing is creating a state, to be very blunt about it. Because can you have a country growing sustainably where there are, people running steel mills on cash, entirely in cash, like a business which is in steel manufacturing is running on cash? Can you have a country where there is mass cheating as a norm? In a state like Uttar Pradesh, mass cheating is going on. Someone comes and tries to stop it. The opposition politicians say that we will allow it. Elect us. We will allow you to cheat wholesale. So, this is the starting point. I think it is lazy to say actually that this is pro-market, this is anti-market, he's a socialist. These are, throwing around labels like this actually is not helpful beyond a point. Like we have to carefully see where are we standing today, and where we are standing today is that there's been frankly a complete absence of state, right? So so many people in the country, the multi-millionaires, even billionaires in the country, they were used to dealing in cash. Entire businesses are running in cash. There is an informal lending market. All kinds of things are going on. Now someone comes in and throws a spanner in the works. Then you say that no, wait, he's regressive, he's this, he's that. But how do you change this? The controversial policy of demonetization. I've written in support of it. I think there was a need to break the pattern. How do you change habits? Those who are living outside the system and then complaining कि मेरा road खराब है, मेरा school नहीं है, मेरा hospital नहीं है, तो भाई सबको अपने taxes तो देने पड़ेंगे ना. We all have to pay our taxes if we want a functional state, if we want a functional government to provide public services. Then we need to pay taxes.
You mentioned this right up where they said why India should not be a superpower. What was the argument given there?
So this was actually a seminar by the eminent historian Ramchandra Guha. I think he was in Canada or something, and he spelled out like 10 reasons why India cannot and must not become a superpower. I think that talk is available on YouTube. But he basically, gives all the problems that are there in the country. He talks about at that time. I mean, interestingly, many of those problems have been resolved. He talks about Maoism or left insurgency and this and that. And frankly, that problem, has been controlled by this government. So he gave essentially what you can call a drain inspector's report. And said that, we cannot and we must not do this because, there are so many problems in India that is this even possible? And then obviously he's on the foreign soil. There are all these I guess American Canadian researchers, students listening to him, and I wonder what they must be thinking.
The moment you mentioned eminent historian and this name, I was like, okay, then I need to listen to the arguments.
So thank you, Harsh, and thank you, Sanjeev, for such a wonderful talk. I have 2-3 questions. So would you want me to list down all the questions so that you can decide who would answer what?
Yeah, just go ahead all together. Fine.
Perfect. All right. When you talked about skepticism and certainism, I resonated with so much because it is not just modernization, but even in the current context with the rising Hindutva, people want you to pick sides. So I'll give you an example. I'm not on any social media platform. I opened a Twitter account, and the status that you put there, I said, I'm a seeker, but a skeptical believer. And I was hounded from all the sides saying that, how can you be so negative about everything? So being skeptical is somehow being called negative. And it is from both the sides, people who associate themselves with left, from the right. So your view on that one. The second question is, when we say, words like dharma, when we say word like karma, they don't fit in the dictionary and people try and look for an English word for it. Shouldn't it be the case that if you don't have the word and if the language is deficient, we should say that, okay, then let's use the word that we have. For example, murti, people are contemplating whether it should be called idol, whether it should be called deity. No, deity is what we see in that. But what is the physical manifestation? The physical manifestation is murti, right? So your views on that. I really love this concept that you talked about. The diversity is skin deep and not soul deep in Western civilization. I would definitely purchase the book and read more about it so that I can come again and probably ask you questions on that. One question that I have is on the judicial reform that we talked about. Some people say that we should have judges for life. Your views on that? And also to say that...
okay, I think this is we will now forget. So let me answer this and then we'll come back to you.
Sure.
Because my short-term memory is terrible. Okay, so I'll take the first question that you've asked about skepticism. I fully understand where you're coming from, and that we actually have a section in the first chapter itself, that is India, that is Bharat, and the section is called Contradictions of an Indian Renaissance. And we actually say, but the fears are not entirely unfounded. One section of the Hindu nationalist so-called spectrum is straying from the tradition that espouses skepticism and openness under the garb of protecting Nehru's land of Bharat from foreigners. In a delicious irony, while purportedly protecting the land from alien faiths, some of the self-anointed protectors have come under the influence of those very foreigners aping their antediluvian diktats. As the philosopher Nietzsche observed, those who fight with monsters should be careful lest they become that themselves. And we go on and we give the example of, we say that these groups seem to have internalized the anti-blasphemy attitudes of medieval Turks and the prudery of Victorian England. And so I see, first of all, there will always be a wide spectrum of opinion. And by that itself, that is to be expected, and we respect that. We also say in this book itself that there are many shades of Hindutva. Like, it depends on how you interpret the word. For us, I think if you're not skeptical, if you say that this is the only reality, to me, that actually sounds very un-Hindu. So, and I've always believed that there are some people who very aggressively argue that, oh my God, any atheist cannot be Hindu. And I said, that may or may not be true. But so long as his or her intentions are fine, I would not want to say that. Because, for example, when I was in college, I would call myself an atheist. None of my parents ever forced me to worship in any way whatsoever. I have come to where I have entirely on my own volition, thinking about what it means to be Indian, to be a human, to be alive, what death means, what family means. I have come to this entirely on my own. And I think to hound people, so as you're saying that, you're a seeker, not a believer, I would say, well, it is what it is. I would say just to ignore, and there are people on all sides who have an extremist view. I, for example, in the last few months have had a few controversies online when I spoke against caste and my interpretation of Jati and Varna. And again, there are very reasonable, intelligent views on all sides of that. But I firmly believe that there should be no birth-based Jati Varna system. And now we are in a different era where we don't do in a non-monetary reciprocal system that some people will deliberately only focus on scholarship and forego money. Others will focus on money. Others will focus on statecraft and military affairs. And the other people will be farmers. And some people will be either in forests or cleaning toilets. To me, that system does not make sense. In today's world, people should have the social mobility and opportunity to be whatever they want. And a lot of people, I would say, are loud. They disagree. But actually, in the larger scheme of things, they are the fringe within the Hindutva movement. I'll tell you why. If you go by the RSS, if you go by the BJP, we'll both agree that they are the leaders of that movement, right? You go by consistently by what Mohan Bhagwat ji is saying, what Narendra Modi ji is saying, and not just what they're saying, what they're doing. This government actually increased the amount, a temporary scheme that is paid to Hindu couples, in which one of the person, man or woman, is a Dalit. Now, you can agree or disagree about the social engineering state ko karna chahiye, nahi karna chahiye. I have mixed feelings about it. But the intention is very clear that we will not be against people from different so-called castes marrying. And this is something that the BJP government is supporting. So I would simply say that, there are people of all opinions, but that is not the mainstream understanding of what we now call the Hindutva or the Sangh Parimar movement, whatever civilizational term you want to use. The term itself is not so important. Rajiv, do you want to add to the second question? I think was, I was telling you my short-term memory is bad. The second question kya tha?
The skepticism part, I fully agree with Harsh. I think just coming online on any platform nowadays, best to have a thick skin. There are all kinds of views, and sometimes the most vocal ones, they seem to be dominant, but they are just vocal actually. So they may not necessarily be the most dominant.
One of the questions was about soul deep and skin deep, and you were mentioning the word dharma and non-translatables. Yes, I agree.
Yeah, so best to use the words as is actually.
Yes, I fully agree.
Many Hindi, Sanskrit words and even words from other Indian languages have come into the English language. Right? So why not these words? So I agree that we should just stick to the words as we use them.
Let's finish my second part of the question. So one was that, there is an argument to say that judges for life. So to say that, they have this hanging sword that once they will retire, they have to again, go and fetch for it. Retirement money would not be enough with the lifestyle that they want to sustain. So to say that, let's take that, employment worry away from them and say that, okay, you can. The other argument for that would be that if the person, like we have it for US right now, right, it's more conservative, board than the liberal or for that matter, the leftist view. That could be one of the implications. The second is the jury system that we used to have.
Today, people worry about the fact that Hindus, for that matter, say that, why are you getting into our practices and justifying our practices by the standards that you somehow have developed? And do you think that the jury system should be back, wherein the common man should have a say in what happens? So your views on that?
So I'll take a first stab at it, then I'll hand over to Rajeev. I think both are very excellent, thought-provoking questions. The first question is, should judges be for life in the Supreme Court, for example, to begin with? The second question is the jury system for the way we have traditionally in common law countries like the UK or US. The first question I will say, given that the Indian system has developed uniquely in the last 70, 75 years, and as we were discussing, this basic structure doctrine, the untrammeled powers that judges have, in the current setup right now, if we go to a US style judge for life, I think I am afraid that will lead to more arrogance and more concentration of power. At least right now, there is a bit of a churn going on. So if somebody is of a certain view, he or she is going to retire in 2 or 3 years. And there is an implicit balance of power, because even though they are selecting the judges, the government at least has the power to withhold their assent for some time. The second time, if they come back with the nomination, then as per their interpretation right now, the government has to agree. But at least the first time, the government can hold it up a bit. So there's a bit of a churn, and every government every 2 or 3 years gets a say. So I would right now, given the balance the way it has developed, not be in favor of for life.
No, and especially with the basic structure doctrine existing as it does. Then I think we would end up creating kind of unelected dictators, actually.
Exactly.
If we had judges for life.
And on the second point on the jury, I think what was the famous movie with like the Akshay Kumar, that was a jury case. I think that was the last jury case that happened in India, right? The Bombay case. The murder, Nanavati, something. I forgot.
Nanavati case, yeah. Nanavati case.
Yeah, so I think that was the last jury case that, if I'm not wrong, that happened in India after independence. But after that, they decided not to go ahead with it, because this person who was clearly a murderer, I think he was exonerated by the jury on the basis of emotions, and oh my God, his wife had cheated on him, and therefore if he took revenge, there was an element of pity for the husband and anger for the person who was murdered, which again, if I'm not wrong, I'm not a lawyer, by the way, but I think that again shows the problems with the jury, right? We have to remember that India became a universal adult franchise democracy when literacy was 10 or 20%. Now it is 60 or 70, 80%. It's much higher amongst the young, for no doubt. It's almost 100% below the age of 20, even though the quality of education is an issue. But we are still nowhere as educated on average compared to a Western nation as of now. I'm sure it will converge within a generation, and then we can relook at it. But the idea in the West, at least in America, if I'm not wrong, is a bit of a lottery system, right? You live in a particular area, and out of a lottery system, some jury members are elected. In today's case, a jury might bring their own views, which might be not in sync with the kind of individual right responsibility. And that's a very difficult thing to struggle with. Like, do you want somebody to say, ki agar usne murder kiya, in that case, he or she deserves it? Kind of a khap panchayat mentality. I think that is problematic. But having said that, I think it's an excellent idea to explore 10, 20 years from now. I fundamentally think the idea of at least some jury review is fundamentally okay. But if you would do it right now, then you'd have to have some kind of qualifications, a cutoff, which would seem elitist and therefore anti-democratic, and therefore it will just become a new controversy. But I could be wrong about it, and I don't have very strong views, to be honest.
I have a question here in written. What causes the increase in left-wing communism policy in India?
Well, I'm not sure if there is an increase of late. I mean, I'm right.
No, but if we trace back the history, actually, what actually led to that rise? I would say it started in the mid 60s or late 60s, and it's a very interesting political aspect to it, where after Lal Bahadur Shastriji's passing, there was a tussle in the Congress as to who would become the leader, and then there was a split in the Congress, actually, in 1969, where Morarji Desai and a number of other sort of centrist, or, again, we are using labels, but non-left or rightist sort of leaders of the Congress left the Congress. And then at that time, actually, Indira Gandhi had to turn to the support of the communists for support. And at that time itself, there was India had a communist like HRD minister, and number of other influences of that type came in the late 60s. And that, I would say, that's where they started entrenching themselves. They sort of took control of the left wing sort of thought process, took control of institutions, took control of universities, starting in the late 60s, early 70s. And that kind of persisted for several decades, obviously. And then obviously now, if anyone says that there is something wrong with it, there is immediately the label that fascist and this that, and they shut down even criticism or any kind of assessment of what they have actually done in the last 30-40 years.
There's a follow-up on that, which says that many say JNU is the center of the leftist ideology in India. You have something to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, that is probably true in terms of a concentrated place of writers, academics, intellectuals who subscribe to that view. And what I would simply add to that is it requires taxpayer rupees for that kind of ecosystem to be sustained. Whereas if you look, I mean, again, what our book is a very small kind of contribution in the larger scheme of things. But it is probably not a coincidence that this kind of book has come from people who are in the private sector, who do not depend on the government dole. And all the so-called trolls of the so-called right-wing online, they are all people working in the private sector, taking some time out on weekdays or weekends and arguing their point of view. It's an organic movement. It does not require any government taxpayer support because it does have more organic support. And therefore, I think it is not a surprise that JNU, with all its subsidized land and subsidized fees and scholarships and stipends, is the center of that.
Hello, thank you so much for giving the opportunity to speak. I'm joining you from Arunachal Pradesh, which is only I'm 3 hours from the Tibetan border, and the Chinese troops are just around the corner here. So I won't waste much time, but I've been following Sangam from the time you've been established. Like you keep on changing the names, Srijan, and then you something else. But I have some concerns, and I don't know whether that'll be based on questions. But see, first of all, whatever you've spoken is amazing, and I'll definitely, would like to buy your book. Not only that, I'm also going to present your book to my friends on their special occasions. But unfortunately, nobody delivers here. Recently, you know that Flipkart actually said Nagaland was a separate country. I hope you people came to know about that. So this is the kind of ignorance people have about the Northeast region. Many of them don't even know about Arunachal Pradesh, and this needs to be addressed. We've tried our best to bridge the gap, and certainly the academics have failed in this regard. Whenever we go out, nobody has any idea of where we came from. Arunachal Pradesh, Tawang, nobody knows. And it is such an important place for India. Thanks to the Chinese meddling of our borders that the people now know about Tawang and Arunachal Pradesh. So I'll just say a few things. I don't know whether this is the right forum also, but you talked about how judges make a mockery of the judgments they pass, like the wine shop and that stuff. I want to illustrate one fact that a few years ago, there was some kind of a stuff that came out that if you needed to have a valid SIM connection, you had to submit your Aadhaar details. Now, people like me and you must have stood in line in Vodafone or Airtel to submit our paperwork and get it done. And it was really a harrowing job. We did it, but we did it. But there was a section of our society that was making fun of all this and was saying, no, we will not submit the documents. Our identities will be revealed to the government. I don't want to talk about that community, but they were the ones who were going around doing the propaganda that this is useless and we will not do this, we will not do this. But we had faith in the judiciary and the government, and that's the reason we stood in the line. We submitted all our personal documents. We had to wait for hours to get our fingerprint registered for a lousy mobile number, but we did it. And ultimately what happened is that the judges came out with the order that, you don't need to submit your other details for your cell phone connection and blah, blah, blah. So the naysayers won. So this is something that needs to stop. Whether it is the wine shop, whether it is submitting the SIM or anything, this needs to stop. So
I'll take the comment.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. First of all, I fully agree that the northeastern 7 states have been neglected in popular discourse. And you are very right that only recently, and partially because of the Chinese Communist Party's incursions, have we actually learned more about areas like Tawang, as you mentioned, which is part of Arunachal. Many people don't even know about the local religions, which are not necessarily Christian or Muslim, but they are part of the broader Dharmic framework, even though they don't go by the word Hinduism. There's a religion that starts with D. I'm forgetting the major religion in Arunachal that way. And so we need to learn much more, and we need to be very, very sensitive. There is a lot of crass racism also that happens, and I don't need to obviously tell you that. And I think all of that has reduced, but more awareness is needed. In terms of the judiciary, of course, Rajiv and I fully agree with you. Rajiv very beautifully explained how they change their views every 4 or 5 months. I think it partially depends on which side of the bed they got out that morning, and what happened in their family lives, because there is no rhyme or reason. And they would even not, just to expand on your example, they would have eKYC allowed for some fintech companies through Aadhaar, and then they suddenly block it, and then they again allowed again. I'm not saying it's entirely the judiciary's fault. Some of the things the government could have also passed as a bill, which is separate from a finance bill and not as an ordinance. So it is a bit more complex and nuanced than that, and I don't want to completely put it on the judiciary. But having said that, the judiciary definitely is very, very, very just wakes up and does things on its whim, and that needs to change. I fully agree. Do you want to add something, Rajiv? Or?
So, even I think defining the ambit of what courts can and can't do. I mean, just entertaining any PIL. Someone files a PIL and they are having a hearing. I mean, that I think some boundaries should be decided and followed, because not everything is up for judicial sort of scrutiny. Some decisions, executive decisions, is the prerogative of the government. So I think those boundaries should be set.
So the name of the religion that I was mentioning was Doni Polo, DONYI-POLO, Donio Polo. And the reason why that is important is there are a lot of these religions which are not quote unquote Hindu, but are part of the Dharmic framework. And it is that shows the civilizational heritage of India, which is fundamentally a lot of what other people would call pagan or polytheistic faiths. And the RSS is doing a good job to make sure that what happens is you still need to give them in a modern world kind of a more supra identity and umbrella identity, because if you don't, they are the first targets of people who want to convert them, whether it is in Arunachal Pradesh, it is in Jharkhand, it is in tribal parts of Madhya Pradesh, Odisha, and other parts of Northeast. So it is very important and beautiful for the rest of Indians, especially quote unquote mainstream Hindus, to learn about faiths like Donio Polo and to kind of preserve that diversity of religion in a broader framework. So I just wanted to mention that beautiful faith.
First of all, thank you for the great talk, Rajiv and Harsh, and thank you, members of the Sangam team and all the questioners. Thanks for your time. I have a few questions. So if you think, I'll go through them one by one. If you think I'm taking too long, please feel free to continue to the next question now. So first question. Here's what I've noticed, that in India, we still suffer from this, slavish mentality. People do not respect the government. They do not think the government works for them, and they do not respect it, and they aim to game the system, right? And they feel proud and they brag about it, Secondly, the government doesn't care about the people, right? The aim of the Babu is to just, get his job done. His salary has nothing to do with how his, customers or people in the district are treated, right? There's essentially no respect from the government to the people and the people to the government. It's almost as if they feel like they're still serving an oppressive regime, as if they were being served for past 1,000 years, right? So how do we recover from this? It seems like a never-ending cycle when no one cares about anyone and the country goes to hell.
What I'll do is I'll quickly take a stab at it, and then you can ask the second question before we forget the next question. And then I think Rajiv already kind of answered the question that you asked in a beautiful way when he was covering chapter 5, but I'll be very quick. You're absolutely right. The problem in India is that a lack of ownership or a sense of ownership of the state. People do not feel, or at least till recently, it's probably changing, they do not feel it is their state the way you absolutely feel in many Western countries. So I sense what you are coming from is absolutely right, and it is vice versa, which is why the chapter 5 is called Decolonizing the Indian State, right? That's the name of the chapter. And we give about not just administrative reform, judicial reform, police reform, But I think what will make a very massive difference, and that only we briefly cover in the book because of lack of space, is local administrative reform. And what I mean by that is, if I'm living in South Calcutta right now and there is a road that is blocked or there is some problem, it's very difficult for me to understand who to call. There is no one strong executive mayor of a large city, and even if it is, it's a very large city. Whereas, what happens if you're living in a US suburb, you have a school, there's a clear sense of accountability. You pay local taxes. There is somebody who's responsible for, you call somebody. It's not a my-bap relationship. And so urban local governance needs to improve. On the rural side, it's even worse because, it was understandable just after independence, after, as you said, 1,000 years of colonization, we kind of wanted to remove rural taxes. That's fine. But now there are no rural taxes. And therefore, all the schemes come from the top. And because if I'm a farmer, if I'm a villager or non-farmer in a rural area, I'm not paying any taxes. I feel कि ऊपर से जो आ रहा है वो अच्छा है. And therefore, I don't worry that much on average about corruption. In economics, political economy is called the flypaper effect. The flypaper effect basically means that when something comes from the top and it flies away, you don't care that much about it. So we need local sources of revenue, property taxes, some agricultural taxes Rajeev and I have written over time, which I think will happen. That's the part of the snowball of the Indian political economy. So that I've worked in villages and I've gone to what are, the technically IAS officer, district magistrates, but locally and colloquially we call them collectors. Colloquially we call them collectors. And the collectors from the British Raj era when they were collecting taxes. Now they're no longer collecting taxes, they're putting out schemes. And I've seen people go and do like literally हाथ जोड़ के बस हमारे गांव के बगल में एक पंप लगा दीजिए. Something very simple, nothing complex. And what is missing in India is the panchayat has no local revenue, tax raising power. The BDO, the local block development officer, has no real power. So it's all top down, it's not bottom up. And despite the Panchayati Raj and the 2 amendments that happened towards the end of the Rajiv Gandhi government, this still has to be done.
No, just I will just say that there is a real misalignment of incentives. There is a real sort of disconnect. Frankly, the officialdom of this country lives in its own bubble. They are kind of disconnected from the impact of their own actions. They are disconnected from the broader economy. They are disconnected from even, any kind of consequence for the wrong decisions or bad decisions they may take. So if you basically are a judge and you decide that this mine should be shut down for some reason and thousands of jobs are lost in Tamil Nadu and India becomes a copper importer, you just made a pronouncement and you walked away. Well, a lot of people lost their livelihoods. Shareholders lost out on, their companies making money. All kinds of downstream effects happened, but for the judge, nothing changed. And the legality or illegality of it is also dubious. It's not always cut and dry. But this kind of power to just say something and that happens, and then the consequence of that is hardly visited upon on the person who made the pronouncement. I think some moderation there would probably be a good idea.
Akhan, very quickly, a second question.
So you see, for me, the government is an organization, a very inefficient one, a very bad one, but it is an organization at the end of the day, which should ideally aim to become more efficient, right? Now, I've worked at a very big and successful tech company, and the way they operate is I would say very scientific, right? Their aim is to collect data, make hypothesize policies, test and implement policy in stages, and evaluate and update performance. This is because their profits rely directly on the success of this, right? This is not the case with government. These people do not care about who's being affected. In fact, it seems like policies are being made for political and personal gain.
So I'll quickly add, I got your point. I'll quickly say that, of course, that's true, first of all, for government all over the world, right? I mean, so in economics, it's called public choice theory. Public choice theory is bureaucrats are maximizing their own bureaucratic empires. They are not necessarily concerned about efficiency. Having said that, in the Indian case, it's worse than obviously that of developed countries. For example, in Singapore, bureaucrats and ministers could get $1 million salaries and they could have incentives. Even if you don't have $1 million salaries in India, Rajeev and I, we do write directly, indirectly. For example, why not have a bonus for the bureaucrats, which part of it is linked to the GDP growth of the average GDP growth of the last 3 years or last 2 years, for example. some skin in the game that could at least make them think that is my decision harming the country's economy and society more broadly, or is it helping it, as opposed to literally looking about their own job. More parallel and lateral entry, more firing of people who are not good enough. And to this government's credit, they're trying all of this. It is a steel frame which is rusting at its core. It takes time. It's a massive ship. If you rotate it too fast, it will lead to an accident. But I'm glad to see that those steps are happening.
You had touched upon it earlier. Like you said that India has an indigenous civilization and other non-indigenous civilizations. Now, there are those who would say that by the same rationale, Kashmir and Pakistan have a civilization that is more in sync with each other. So, how do we counter that?
So,
another quick thing is whether do you think the caste fault lines would go away in the next 15 to 20 years?
So, Ashwin, both are excellent questions. On the first question, I think before you joined, we had spoken specifically on Kashmir itself. I had read out a section from the book called Kashmir, Pakistan, and Karl Popper. But I'll very quickly add to that. And on the caste fault lines, I do think in the next 20, 30 years, they will go away. But before I speak on Kashmir, I want Rajeev to make some comments.
No, actually on Kashmir, I think, we made the case, India, so Indian civilization. So when we say fundamentalism, let's talk about the fundamentals. What are the fundamentals of, if you want to call India a Hindu nation, what are the fundamentals of Hindutva or a Hindu nation? Well, it is inclusivity, it is mutual respect, it is equal treatment of all, right? Which is unlike, let's say, an Islamic republic like Pakistan. If you are a non-Islamic person in an Islamic republic, then you are by definition, you are a second-class citizen. And that is reflected in their laws. That is the reality. Whereas in India, what everybody's asking for is equal treatment before the law. Even what our ethos and our plural sort of way of thinking is about is that it doesn't differentiate or doesn't. It's not that there are not flaws in it today, but is it anybody's case that those flaws should be corrected? Like, is anybody saying that we want to persist with this? I don't think so. We want to move to a place where we want equality for all. So I think that fundamental difference is there, and that should be recognized when we try to equate the two civilizations.
And more quickly, Ashwin. So I'll quickly add to Rajiv's point. See, partition, in my view, is that if you want to keep India democratic and substantially keep its dharmic character, nobody I know that wants to undo partition today, because that will lead to 350 million more Muslim subcontinental citizens, right? People might be for Akhand Bharat in a larger abstract sense in a future where people voluntarily want to join the dharmic kind of a worldview. Then it's a different. Then it's a very happy news. It's a different news. So right now they don't do so. So partition is a reality, and it's an acknowledgement of 1.25 million of Islamic presence in the subcontinent. Fine. So the partition has happened. Now the question is, where do the boundaries lie? So then, if people who do not right now, who want to suppress Shia Muslims, who want to suppress Muslim feminists, who want to suppress Sikhs, Hindus, Buddhists in what was Jammu and Kashmir and are now 2 union territories, they are free to go to Gilgit-Baltistan, Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, what they call Azad Kashmir, and they are free to follow the policies they want to. There have been transfers of population, not complete, but for example in Bengal, and even more so in what was undivided Punjab. So as far as I know, we are not trying to deliberately stop people from living under Pakistani Sharia laws. So the division is final. There is going to be no more religion-based division of the subcontinent. Now, of course, they claim all of Kashmir or the Jammu and Kashmir. We also claim Gilgit-Baltistan and what they call Azad Kashmir, the Muzaffarabad area. We might have a deal at some point. We do claim, our parliament fully claims that area. But the partition as of now is on the ground, it is final. So I don't see how in any way we are wrong, because we are not treating people who are within that system any unfairly, because if they are going to any other part of India, occasionally there is some anger against some Kashmiri students in some hostels. But many of them are in Bollywood, many of them are in business, many of them are universities across the country. They have the same protections. In fact, as we have mentioned, as Rahul has mentioned, because of the soft appetite against the Hindu majority in some cases. The case can be argued that even in the rest of India, in some educational and religious institutional sense, they have more privileges than the Hindu majority. Although there are some exceptions for linguistic Hindu minorities in some states. So my point, we write about Karl Popper, we write about this, we take the analogy of Ireland. We say that, for example, if at least Pakistan were to go through enlightenment, either liberalism or dharma, and where not just other non-Muslims, but even Shias or Ahmadis and other people could actually live equally, then at least, and then overwhelmingly people don't want to be with India, then at least there is some case to think about. But even then, what about all the non-Muslims? If it's only the Kashmir Valley which is Muslim majority. What about Jammu? What about Ladakh? So, and then if that is the case, so what about Muslim majority area of Kerala on the coast? Would you allow that to be partitioned 20 years from now? And if so, I'm not saying if so, then how does the Hindu majority look at the remaining Muslim minority in the rest of the country as future secessionists? So there are real issues in terms of even in a humane way, but also in a strategic way.